Mayor Glenn Grant.
Present.
Councillors Claude McIntosh.
Present.
Sid Gardner.
Here.
Dean Hollingsworth.
Present.
Catalina Hébert.
Présente.
Councillors Elaine MacDonald.
Present.
Justin Towndale.
Present.
And Eric Bergeron.
Present.
We are waiting for Dennis Carr to arrive, and both Councillors Dupel and Bennett have called in their regrets, Mr. Mayor.
Just to acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional territory of the Mohawk people of Akwesasne. Are there any disclosures of interest for tonight's meeting? Hearing none, I have a motion to go into the committee of the whole. Matt, Councillor Sid, all in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Presentations.
Water Conservation and Servicing Master Plan, presentation by Watson and Associates Economist. And we have Ms. Bailey here too, and Mr. DeWitt to introduce our presenter.
I'll introduce Sean Michael from Watson and Associates. So Sean Michael is here this evening to present the water meter plan following a number of reports to council. And first we did a rate study, and then you have a plan in your book along with the presentation. So I think we'll start with the presentation, and there is places in the presentation that we will stop for questions because it is a pretty long presentation to make. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So, your next slide, please. So, just first in terms of the agenda, as it is, there's a fair amount of material to cover. As Tracy mentioned, following the introduction to the presentation, the agenda will include the topics of the community outreach and public engagement plan, the water and wastewater rate structures that have been considered, the water conservation incentives and rebates, the financial plan that's been prepared, as well as the subsequent rate forecasts and customer impacts, and the proposed next steps. And so following the introduction, after the conclusion of each one of these major agenda sections within the presentation, we'll pause to take any questions that might be related to that section. Next slide. So the Water Conservation and Servicing Master Plan that has been prepared has been done so in response primarily to the identified need for a water conservation program as identified by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And within that recommendation, what was put forth is that the city should be assessing potential conservation programs and alternatives and auditing that program. And what's been proposed as a key component of a water conservation program for the city is the installation of citywide water meters on all service properties to be the primary component of that water conservation program, as well as to allow the city to audit those water conservation initiatives going forward. Tying into that recommendation, there's other guidelines that are put forth by the ministry towards the financially sustainable drinking water and wastewater systems that influence and tie into the master plan process that we've gone through. Those include having a transparent public engagement process, in which we'll talk about the community engagement plan that we've gone through in a bit more detail, that there should be a generation of sustainable revenues for the reliable services and future rehabilitation replacement of infrastructure, so providing funds to make sure that the capital infrastructure is maintained and replaced to provide sustainable levels of service. And as well, the last item being fairly key in terms of the water conservation master plan is that there should be equitable outcomes in the promotion of water conservation through the key principle of users paying for the services that they do receive. Next slide. So in terms of the process that we've gone through to date, so in 2021, we've gone through the Water Conservation Servicing Master Plan, but in the past couple of years have been a couple key components leading up to this stage in the process. So first of all, stemming from the ministry recommendation in 2019, city staff did report to council on the need for a water conservation program and the potential implementation of citywide meters. And then undertook an initial preliminary public engagement process to assess some of the initial opinions and feedback on the city's current rate structure, as well as the need for water meters. Then in last year, in 2020, as part of the update to the city's water and wastewater rate study and the water financial plan that was required to be updated and submitted to the province, we did look at and present to council rate structure alternatives, water conservation incentives and rebates that are commonly offered in the province, looked at a preliminary fiscal and ratepayer impacts of implementing citywide meters. The city had engaged the St. Lawrence River Institute to begin some initial outreach and education activities around water conservation, including preparing some water conservation guides that have been on the water conservation section of the city's website, and then preparing the water financial plan with then council's approval to commence with the master plan in 2021. And then so as we touched on in the agenda items, the key components of the Water Conservation Servicing Master Plan have been the community outreach regarding water conservation and public engagement, and then the key outcomes and recommendations being around citywide water metering and the alternative rate structures related to that, the potential water conservation and incentives and rebates that are being recommended, and then showing in detail the potential fiscal impacts for the city, as well as potential impacts on ratepayers of moving to a metered rate structure. So, next slide, please. So firstly, the community outreach that was undertaken this year as part of this undertaking was a continuation of the work that the St. Lawrence River Institute had undertaken in 2020. And primarily, three of the key deliverables there were videos that were created and incorporated into the city's website and promoted through the city's social media channels around education on the scarcity of water, and that it is not an unlimited resource for the city, and then providing additional tips and guidelines on indoor water conservation efforts, as well as the efficient outdoor use of water. Next slide. And then with the public engagement plan leading into the final recommendations, it was prepared in three distinct phases. The first being to inform the general public on a number of matters. So that being to provide some clear background on how water and wastewater services are provided in the city, outlining exactly what the issue is and the potential solutions in terms of the installation of water meters and the incentive and rebate programs, and then defining what the opportunities would be for engagement so the public would know when and how they would be and could be involved in the solution, and providing their input through a number of initiatives that we'll discuss in a moment, and then outlining the timeline as well. So in the second phase of the plan, which was primarily to gauge the public's opinion and understanding of a number of issues related to the delivery of water and wastewater services and the funding of those services, was around desired service levels, agreement with user pay principles, the feedback on potential and current rate structures and the equity of those structures, as well as the incentives and rebates and the perceived impacts of those on individuals' behavior. And then lastly, the third phase would be to summarize the feedback that was received through the report and presentation, and provide that to those individuals that were involved. Next slide, please. So just on a couple of the initiatives that were utilized in the public engagement plan, and as well to just identify that in undertaking this public engagement plan, the city communication staff played a key role in this, and we're quite dedicated to this project and moving this forward, especially around one of the new initiatives being to use the Have Your Say Cornwall website as a new public engagement initiative for the city through this exercise, which was utilized primarily due to the, initially utilized primarily due to the pandemic environment and needing to make sure that we had a transparent and user-friendly way to engage with the public in a virtual setting. And so a couple of the things that were developed and produced for this master plan was a whiteboard video outlining the way in which services are provided in the city, how they're currently funded, what the opportunities would be for engagement, and how individuals could be involved. There was a public survey that was prepared and provided through that platform, as well as a number of other quick polls and mini surveys to engage the public in the exercise. And then as well, throughout the exercise, there was also a question and answer forum on the public engagement site, as well as the opportunity to ask questions through the social media platforms, which city staff were fairly diligent to in providing public responses to all questions that were asked by the public. So in terms of designing the public survey that was undertaken, so it was designed primarily in response to a number of the feedback items that were received as part of the initial 2019 outreach that was undertaken by the city. And so with that work in 2019, that provided an initial baseline of some of the general opinions and feedback that was out there, in which there was generally an opposition to water meters. There was a disagreement generally in the responses about whether there's any linkages between water meters and conservation, as well as a belief that water meters would always result in increased costs to residents. And so with that sort of general overview of how the public responses were leaning towards water meters, the survey that was developed for this exercise was not developed to specifically ask about water meters themselves, but to ask about opinions and feedback on a lot of policies and principles related to how services are provided and how they should be funded, with the knowledge that those responses can give us insight into what types of rate structures and what types of user pay policies would be preferred. And so as I alluded to earlier, some of the key items that we were looking to receive feedback on were desired levels of service and water and wastewater funding principles. For example, whether those should be funded through tax or through rates. Feedback on billing structures, the equity of those billing structures for different user groups and user pay principles, and as well as what the perceived impact was of water consumption and behavior as a result of any water conservation initiatives and rebates that may be offered. And so one of the other key items to providing the general public with a good sound information base in terms of providing feedback was to develop with city staff a calculator that would allow individuals to determine what the impact might be on their water and wastewater bill based on the potential metered rate structures. And so through the preliminary analysis that was undertaken in 2020 as part of the rate study and financial plan, what was revealed was that currently, on average, residential customers in the city are paying a greater share of the cost of funding the systems than non-residential customers are. And so what we knew was that moving to a metered rate structure would allow to correct for some of those inequities, and on average, residential customers would pay less than they currently are under a metered rate structure. And so the water and wastewater bill calculator was developed so that individuals could be encouraged to take this prior to, or to utilize this prior to undertaking the survey, so that they could see how their actual bill in 2020 might change under the proposed rate structure, and be able to assess how that might change under other levels of consumption that would be seen in, on average in the province of Ontario, as well as that they might be able to enter themselves, so that they could really understand by entering in their account number what they currently are paying and how that might change based on the proposed rate structure. And then with the question and answer forum as well being one of the other key components of the engagement, was that was offered throughout throughout all phases of the exercise, and those all responses were provided publicly to the general public through the website. Next slide, please. So, in terms of what we heard from the question and answer, so there was quite a few questions provided. The detail of those questions and answers that were provided are in Appendix C to the report. They can be generally grouped into three broad categories in descending order in terms of the responses that were received. So firstly, there was a number of questions more generally about the master plan process, water meters, including the installation of those meters and how services are delivered. The next most popular response was a general opposition to water meters, usually related to a belief there would be an increased cost and increased customer bills, as well as concerns around the installation process for meters. And then lastly, support for water meters, especially around potential reductions in water bills for individuals that felt their usage was low. So what we heard from the survey was that in terms of desired levels of service, 96% of respondents agreed that safe and reliable drinking water should be provided to all homes and businesses. And while this may seem somewhat obvious, I think this is a fairly key outcome, because regardless of council's decision on the installation of water meters, this supports the rationale that your rates, in whatever structure they are, should be full cost rates to fund your operating long-term life cycle costs of your infrastructure. And this also aligns with the ministry's principles of providing reliable services and the future rehabilitation and replacement of infrastructure. What was a little bit surprising in terms of the responses we received was that 60% disagreed with recovering the cost through user rates, and that so 60% would have preferred taxes as a method of recovery for water and wastewater service costs. This obviously contrasts the principles from the ministry in terms of users paying for the service they receive, as well as the city's current policy, as well as the way in which water and wastewater services are funded by almost all municipalities across the province. And so with those responses in mind, it was interesting to note that the responses to the other questions that we asked through the survey differed in some cases based purely on whether they agreed with user pay principles or recovering through taxes. And so to highlight a couple of the other questions that were asked and the responses, one of the questions was that asking about agreement with the statement of the rate structure that is imposed should be consistent for all users. And as we can see here, the majority, so in the dark blue bars, those are the responses of all individuals who took the survey. And we can see that the majority of individuals were either neutral or agreed with that statement. But then in the orange bars are the responses from those individuals who agreed with user rates in general. As we can see that relationship is even greater in terms of the majority of those individuals agreeing or strongly agreeing with a consistent rate structure. So in contrast to the city's current rate structure, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. In terms of the next question, I wanted to highlight that water and wastewater bills should be based on your water consumption. And so here, as you might expect, in the responses from all individuals, the results were somewhat evenly distributed across the levels of agreement with that statement, as about 60% disagreed with charging with user pay principles to begin with. But then we focus on those individuals who agreed with user rates. We see that there's an overwhelming agreement with that statement as well, that water and wastewater bills should be tied to your demand for the service and your consumption. And then lastly, in terms of some of the responses around rebates and incentives, the likelihood of saving money on an annual bill purely through using metered rates was not seen as sufficient reason for individuals to make infrastructure improvements, such as installing higher efficiency toilets. However, the inclusion of financial rebates towards the purchase of a high-efficiency toilet, for example, significantly increased the perceived likeliness of making those infrastructure upgrades. And so our takeaway from that was that provided support for conservation incentives and rebates as part of the water conservation program. And so next steps in terms of the engagement would be that prior to the implementation of metered rates, is that the city would continue to consult with non-residential stakeholders on aspects of the water conservation program specific to their industries, and make any recommendations stemming from those discussions, and then as well to continue the outreach and education program and educating the community about the benefits of water conservation. So I'll pause there if there are any questions.
Councillor McIntosh.
I don't want to, I want to ask my questions at the end rather than make a disjointed thing. I've got a number of questions here. So will we have time at the end to ask, go right
Yes,
back through the whole thing? Good.
We could wait to the end to ask all questions. That way we'll have all the information, if that's council's wishes. Councillor McDonald.
This is just a question about simple meaning of a term, so can I ask it now? Because we're past it. You know,
Go ahead.
I'm just, you lost me on how the equity factor is operative. You know, there was a string of terms on page 9. It came back up again on page 11. It had to do with user pay, billing structures, and then equity. So how does somehow this relate to, how does this bring equity? Like, because people use what they pay for what they use, or is that how equity is operative here?
Yes, so Jenna, is the system which individuals are charged for the service equitable in terms of their demand for that service and their benefit from the service?
Didn't know if, you know, that's a pretty broad term, means
Sure.
a lot of things in different contexts, so thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for letting me.
Okay, so we'll wait till the full presentation, then we'll get into questions.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So in terms of the alternative water and wastewater structures that were assessed, we looked at the rate structures commonly utilized in Ontario and reviewed these with staff with regard for a number of key items, so that being their ability to recover the full cost of service, as well as providing revenue stability for the city, the administration and ease of implementation related to the rate structures, the equity, as I just mentioned, around that structure, so the ability for the city to align the recovery of costs with the beneficiaries of the service, the abilities of the rate structure to promote water demand management objectives, so promoting water conservation, and as well how they relate to the industry best practices. And so what's important to recognize as well is that when selecting a rate structure, especially a change in rate structure, is the individual circumstances and goals of the municipality are fairly key in terms of whether that rate structure is appropriate for the circumstances. And so This chart outlines a couple of key aspects of the main rate structures that are imposed in Ontario. And so just to note first that property tax as a basis for cost recovery is not included in this comparison because the amount paid obviously changes directly with the market value assessment of the property. And so within the four rate structures that are listed here, that being a flat rate in which an individual pays a set fee regardless of water consumption, a constant rate in which an individual pays a set fee per cubic meter of water consumed regardless of how much water they consume, and then the last two rate structures being a declining block and an inclining block, in which again it's a rate per cubic meter of water consumed, but with that rate either decreasing as water consumption increases or increasing as water consumption increases. And so on the left-hand graph for each rate, that is showing how the cost per unit of consumption changes as consumption increases, and on the right-hand side, it's showing how the total cost to a customer changes as consumption changes. And so with a flat rate structure, we can see that as you consume more water, your cost per unit of water consumed decreases, and your total cost remains constant. This rate structure obviously provides a great deal of revenue stability. However, it may not provide for the full cost of service, as it does not change in response to changes in water demand and the changes in cost that might relate to that. As well, with a flat rate, it also doesn't promote any water conservation, and as well, it might even promote the wasting of water if the rate is set too high. An individual's perception, they feel they need to get their money's worth. And lastly, in terms of the equity of that rate, again, it doesn't provide for that alignment of the benefits of service in terms of individuals have a greater or lower demand for water and wastewater services. With a constant rate, a constant per cubic meter rate for water usage, that cost per unit remains constant regardless of consumption, but as you use more water, obviously your total bill will increase, and as such it does provide for promoting water conservation and is generally fairly easy to administer from a municipal standpoint as long as water meters are installed. With the last two rate structures being an inclining and declining block structure, so these two rate structures generally require a fair bit of historical detailed information in terms of customer usage patterns to ensure that the thresholds in which rates may be increasing or decreasing are set at the appropriate level so that there are not unintended consequences of the specific rate structure. With the inclining block structure, that method has the greatest impact on promoting water conservation as rates increase as water usage increases. So the current rate structure in the city is that residential customers are charged a flat rate structure, with that flat rate being based on the number of water using fixtures in the home, such as number of toilets or faucets. And so while this structure attempts to align a flat rate structure to the demand for service, what we know from looking at the city's data is that the number of fixtures may not have a direct correlation to water consumption and water demand. In the non-residential sector, customers are charged actually one of two different rate structures, that being either a flat rate structure similar to the residential customers or charged on a constant per cubic meter basis. And so the implications of the city's current rate structure is that it does obviously provide for a stable revenue source, However, with the exception of the metered non-residential customers, it does not respond to changes in demand or promote water conservation. And as well as I'll discuss a little bit further, there are inequities that exist between the flat rate and volume-based rate customers, as well as between residential and non-residential customers in terms of the burden of the cost recovery and the demand for service. So to illustrate some of those inequities a bit further, firstly in terms of the inequities between non-residential customers that currently exist. So the first example is a comparison of two non-residential customers, one who consumes 30 cubic meters annually and is charged a flat rate, and the second customer who consumes 650 cubic meters of water, but is also charged a flat rate, as shown on the left-hand side in the dark blue bars in terms of the difference in water consumption. On the right-hand side in the light blue-green bars, we can see that these two customers, one who consumes about 22 times the amount of water as the other customer, currently pay the exact same bill, based on the number of water using fixtures in their property. And this example being based on actual customers in the city currently. Similarly with the example number 2, again based on actual customer records, we have two customers who consume the exact same amount of water annually, 700 cubic meters annually, but one is charged based on the number of fixtures and one is charged based on consumption using your current rates. The customer is charged based on consumption pays 7 times less than the customer is charged based on the number of water using fixtures. So again, a fair discrepancy there in terms of the demand for service versus what those individuals are currently charged. And then to illustrate the inequities currently between residential and non-residential customers, using the demand, the annual water demand as a proxy for that benefit of service, we can see that of the 9.1 million cubic meters of treated water that is consumed by all residential and non-residential customers in the city, about 67% of that is by residential customers. But when we look at the annual water and wastewater revenue, about 84% of that comes from the residential sector. So 2/3 of the demand being from non-residential, only 16% of the revenue is coming from non-residential users. Next slide. And then to look at the industry best practices in terms of the types of rates that are imposed in the province, we surveyed the water rates for 271 municipalities in Ontario. And as you can see on the map, in the dark blue shaded sections, those are municipalities which currently have water meters and impose rates that are composed of both a flat rate component as well as a metered rate component for the same customers. The blue-green municipalities are those who have water meters and impose only a metered charge. And then in the red shaded municipalities are those that do not have water meters. And so 85% of all the municipalities surveyed do currently have water meters and impose metered rates. Of the municipalities who do not, excluding Cornwall and Timmins, which have populations of greater than 40,000 people, all of the average population of the other non-metered municipalities is less than 4,000 people. So showing that it is generally smaller municipalities or municipalities with only small development areas that are serviced that do not currently have water meters. And then in terms of the types of metered rate structures, of those municipalities that have metered water rates, 88% of them, those being those in the dark blue shaded area, impose a rate that's composed of both a monthly base charge or flat rate as well as a metered rate for those customers. So the recommended structure then for the city within a citywide water metering proposal is that beginning in 2025, when it's anticipated that all water meters would be installed, is that the city would move to a rate structure that would be comprised of a monthly base charge, which would be differentiated by the size of the meter at the property, plus a volume-based rate in terms of a dollar per meter cube rate for the water that is consumed. The rationale for having a monthly base rate that increases as the water meter size increases at the property is that having part of the bill fixed and tied to the size of the water meter recognizes that there is a portion of the cost of providing these services that is fixed in relation to the fact that there is infrastructure in the ground that needs to be in place and operational so that services are available. It needs to be maintained and replaced in line with your asset management plan needs, and that demand for that infrastructure is tied to the water meter size in terms of your potential demand for the service. And then in combination with that, having a volumetric rate as a part of the overall bill recognizes that the variable cost component gives customers some control over their bill in terms of their water consumption and responds to changes in demand as well. And the structure would be uniform across both residential and non-residential customers, providing or removing those inequities that currently exist. The one other item that's proposed to be included within the rate structure is that over a 7-year period, once the water meters are installed and operational, is that there would be an annual charge to the existing residents and businesses to recover the water meter installation costs. That would apply only to existing residents and businesses, as any new homes or businesses would pay for the installation of their water meter through the building permit process. So with the water metering, what is also being proposed is that the type of water meters that would be installed would be advanced meter reading technology water meters. And so some of the benefits of this of these types of meters in which they don't require a manual reading of the meters, and information that is constantly being uploaded and sent to the city and can be utilized by the city and the users, is that with that you've improved customer service through the use of the timely data. So one example being the city is able to identify unusual water use in real time and provide automatic customer notifications for things such as running toilets or unidentified leaks. It allows customers to utilize the online platform to manage their water use should they wish, and as well as the ability to pay only for the water that is used. Some of the key city benefits of using these types of water meters are that without having to have resources dedicated towards the manual reading of meters, can reallocate those resources towards system monitoring and repair. With the water meters installed throughout the city, that also allows staff the ability to have improved and early leak detection, resulting in some other benefits such as reduced operating costs from finding those leaks earlier, typically lower costly repairs of finding those leaks and addressing them earlier as well. And then from a city and customer benefit, being able to schedule those repairs at a convenient time that's less disruptive to residents and businesses within the city when those leaks are able to be addressed earlier. As well, with being able to identify water consumption by area throughout the city, it also assists in the ability to plan for the rehabilitation of works, as well as the demand on the system and what expansions might be required. And then lastly, in alignment with the city's community strategic plan, it also reduces the environmental footprint. So the water conservation incentives and rebates that are being recommended began first with surveying the best practices in a number of municipalities in the province. And the recommendations that have been brought forth look at some of the most common residential programs that are in place and those that could be easily administered and implemented with the most significant benefits to customers from a water conservation standpoint. And so those being rebates for the replacement of low efficiency toilets with high efficiency toilets, as well as home water audit programs. And of the proposed budget within the financial plan for the rebates in the home water audit program is about $100,000 per year. Some of the other residential incentives that were assessed that the city could consider investigating in the future once some of the initial water conservation gains are made include water efficient landscaping, home certification programs, rain harvesting programs, as well as gray water reuse programs that are beginning to be used in some municipalities in the province. So what has been proposed with the toilet rebate program is firstly that it would be available only for homes built prior to 1997, as of 1996, homes were required to be built with a 6-liter or lower flush toilet as per the building code. And so the program would allow for the replacement of a greater than 13-liter per flush toilet with a WaterSense labeled toilet that has less than 4.8 liters per flush, providing a rebate of $50 per toilet with a maximum of 2 per home. And that level of rebate being consistent with the rebates that are offered primarily in the province. In terms of non-residential rebates and incentives, as I mentioned, there are not recommendations being made at this time, but that the city will be consulting with the non-residential sector further. Some of the potential rebates and incentive programs that will be investigated and discussed include the replacement of low efficiency equipment in a similar fashion to the residential toilet rebate program for things such as residential restaurant spray valves, dental vacuum pumps, and water-cooled refrigeration units being a key item. Similar to the residential program, audit and consultation and partnering opportunities to identify water-saving alternatives. And then another opportunity that's offered in some municipalities, such as the city of Guelph, is what are sometimes called capacity buyback programs, in which reductions in long-term water use are assessed in terms of their deferral of water and wastewater capacity upgrades and a rebate offered in that regard. So in assessing the master plan and preparing the master plan, the financial impacts of the water conservation program have been considered, and they've been done so in the context of the sustainable funding of the overall water and wastewater systems over the period from 2021 to 2030, being incorporated into the water and wastewater rate study and financial plan that were prepared in 2020. And so a couple of the key items of that financial plan being looking at the forecast water demand, what the long-term capital costs and financing requirements are, and the operating cost and revenue impacts as well. So first, in terms of the forecast water demand, what has been identified with city staff throughout this process is that the average water demand per residential customer, which is currently 269 cubic meters per year, would be targeted to be reduced to about 203 cubic meters per year with the water conservation program and the installation of the water meters. That consumption level of 203 cubic meters per year per customer still being 36% higher than the average residential use per household in the city. And so that would see the total water demand in the city decreasing from just over 9 million cubic meters to about 7.7 million cubic meters in 2025, before increasing slightly with growth over the remainder of the period. In terms of the capital needs and the anticipated financing of not only the water meter installation, but as well the other capital and operating costs of the water and wastewater systems over the 10-year period. As you can see in the bottom right-hand line in the dark blue, titled Total, the total capital cost for the water and wastewater systems over the 10-year period would be just over $152 million, or about $15 million per year. Those costs would be financed through primarily reserves and transfers from rate revenue, being $102.7 million of the total cost, with just under $50 million being funded through debt. And so $6 million of that being related to growth-related development charge eligible projects, and about $43 million being related to other capital needs of the water and wastewater systems. Within that $43 million is included about $16 million for the installation of the water meters themselves. And so with what we also wanted to make sure we had regard for in terms of the capital needs and the anticipated financing plan is whether that level of additional debt is sustainable from a legislated debt borrowing limit capacity. And so in the bottom half of this table, what we've shown is that the estimated current utilization of debt is about 5% of own source revenues, with the provincially legislated limit being 25% of own source revenues, and the city's internal policy being that annual principal and interest repayments should not exceed 10% of own source revenues. And so with the additional water and wastewater debt that's anticipated, as well as accounting for other tax-based debt that's anticipated within the city's financial plan, that metric of annual debt financing costs as a percentage of own source revenues would increase to about just under 8% in 2027, still below the city's self-imposed limit of 10% and well below the legislated limit of 25%, before decreasing to 6.9% by 2030 as existing debt is retired and own source revenues increase. Then in terms of the operating costs within the financial plan, so they're based on generally two components, one being the current operating expenditures inflated at 2% per year, the capital-related expenditures being transfers to reserves and an annual debt financing cost based on that capital funding plan. And then as well, the city has identified estimated cost savings due to operational cost savings due to reduced water use at about $300,000 per year, and as a result of improved leakage detection at about $70,000 per year. And then also within the financial plan is a $100,000 annual budget related to the water conservation rebates and incentives. And so in the graph at the bottom of this slide, what you can see in the above the dark blue section, which is the city's operating costs, are the capital-related components of the annual operating costs. And so though that increase in the annual operating costs over the 10-year period is generally being driven by the increase in capital funding, which is being driven by, again, the asset management plan needs of the city. And so in terms of the annual revenue requirement by 2030, only about 2% of that relates to the cost of the replacement of water meters. And so generally the move towards a citywide watering program having a fairly nominal impact in terms of the overall revenue requirement by 2030, representing only 2% of those annual costs. So then, in terms of the customer impacts that could be anticipated with the anticipated rate forecast. So the rate forecast has been broken down into two components, that being the period from 2022 to 2024, which would be which is when the city would be operating within their current rate structure. And so what's anticipated is that those per fixture rates for both residential and non-residential customers would increase by 5% per year. And then the consumptive rates for the existing residential metered customers is that their rates would increase by closer to 10% per year. Over the 2025 to 2030 period, being when the water meters would be installed and a metered water rate could be imposed, is when the new rate structure would be in place. And so the rate structure has been developed to phase in the impacts on non-residential customers, especially those with larger meters, and to phase in the benefits to the residential customers as well. And so one of the key considerations in doing so is, as we saw the significant imbalance between water demand and revenues generated by the residential and non-residential sectors, we wanted to have regard for the change in the structure and the impact that would have on the non-residential customers in terms of phasing in that change in the rate structure and those impacts on the non-residential customers. And so with the monthly base charge, it would be differentiated by meter size and the volumetric rate per cubic meter. There would be as well an $80 annual charge on all existing residential and non-residential customers over a 7-year period from 2025 to 2031. And so just to illustrate that rate structure a little bit further for residential customers, what's shown here is that currently the average residential customer in the city pays $740 per year. That would increase to $857 by 2024 based on those 5% annual increases. And then with the change to the metered rate structure in 2025, we can see that annual bill would increase by about 7.4% for this customer consuming 203 cubic meters of water per year, being that targeted level of water use, followed by about 0.5% annual increases thereafter. And so what's notable as well is that while the total annual bill would increase to about $944 by 2030, in 2032, when the annual $80 per year water meter installation charge is no longer applicable, that total annual bill would increase down towards the level seen in 2024 at about $864, so below the rates that would be imposed with the change to water meters. And the bottom half, the graph on the bottom half of this slide then identifies what the average annual rate increases have been in 85 municipalities surveyed through the BMA municipal study. And what is shown here is that the median rate increase over that 2014 to 2020 period, in terms of the median increase in residential bills for those municipalities surveyed, was about 4.2% per year, and that compares to rate increases over the same period in the city of about 3.2%. So historically, rates in the city have been increased at lower than what has been seen generally within the province. And with the proposed increases for this customer, average residential customer, what would be seen is about a 2.7% increase overall across the 10-year period. So below that median level that's been seen provincially and below what the city has seen as well over the past 6 years. And so then to continue to sort of investigate those customer impacts a little bit further, one of the key things to sort of identify and clarify at the outset is while we expect on average residential customers to see a decrease in their bill, and on average, non-residential customers would see an increase. The actual impacts for individual customers are going to be very much dependent on how they are currently charged in terms of whether they're charged on a metered or per fixture rate, how many fixtures they have in their home and what their current bill is, and what their future water consumption will be as well, because there will be, within the residential sector, some individuals who end up paying more than they currently do and some who pay less, and similarly in the non-residential side as well, this being an unavoidable consequence of changing a rate structure. Anytime you change a rate structure, there is always going to be some individuals that are more greatly or less affected. And so looking at 3 separate residential customers to illustrate that point a little bit further, the first customer being what we would call a small usage customer, consuming 100 cubic meters per year with a 3/4 inch meter. The first line in the comparison is looking at what their rates would be or what their annual bills would be under the current rate structure in the city. We can see that bill would increase from about $740 that they're paying the average amount in the city up to $1,148. However, under the proposed metered rate structure, that bill would increase to $857 in 2024 before decreasing to $760 and then up to $780 by the end of the period. So by 2030, that customer would pay $369 less than they would pay under the current rate structure. The second customer comparison that we saw on the previous slide is the average consumption that's targeted within the city for households being 203 cubic meters per year. By 2030, we can see that customer would pay about $204 less than the average residential customer would pay under your current rate structure in 2030. And then, as I mentioned, by 2032, when the annual $80 meter charge is no longer applicable, which is included within this total cost, their total annual bill would then decrease down to levels seen in 2024 under the current rate structure. And then lastly, for a household that consumes the average consumption per household currently in the city and continues to consume at that level over the period to 2030, by 2030, their annual bill would be $1,049 for water and wastewater, about $100 less than the annual bill under the current rate structure. And again, in 2032, when that annual meter charge is no longer applicable, their bill would decrease down to the level seen in 2026 under the current rate structure. Next slide, please. And so a couple more illustrations in terms of the different residential impacts that might be seen with the change in structure. So in this graph, what we're showing here is 2 customers who both currently pay a flat rate structure and both consume 100 cubic meters of water per year. And again, this comparison being based on actual customers within the city. So currently, there would be 2 residential customers with the exact same consumption profile of 100 cubic meters annually, one paying $500 per year, one paying $900 per year. The solid red and blue lines show how that annual bill would increase over the period of 2024 under the current rate structure, and then the dotted lines extrapolate how that annual bill would continue to change with the current rate structure were it imposed beyond 2024. So we can see that customer number 1 in the red increasing from $900 to just under $1,400 under the current rate structure. customer number 2 increasing from $500 to about $776 under the current rate structure. With the change to the recommended metered rate structure in 2025, what we would see is that customer number 1 would decrease by about 27% in 2025, seeing their bill decrease to $760. Customer number 2 actually seeing a 31% increase in that year. And then that annual bill increasing only by about 0.5% thereafter to about $779, about the same amount that customer number 2 would pay under the current rate structure. So again, showing that depending on the specific characteristics of the current households, that there may be increases or decreases with the proposed change. And again, in the showing another two customers, these being customers that consume at the current average residential amount of 269 cubic meters per year. One currently paying $600, one currently paying $850, dependent on their number of water using fixtures in their home. At 2025, we would see about a 47% increase for customer number 2, while the bill for customer number 1 would remain relatively unchanged. And by 2030, both customers would pay $1,049 in comparison to customer number 1, who would otherwise pay just over $1,300 under the current rate structure, and customer number 2, who would have paid just over $100 less at $931 under the current rate structure. Then moving on to non-residential customer impacts, the current and proposed rate structure and the annual bill impacts is shown here for an average non-residential customer consuming about 441 cubic meters of water annually and having a 2-inch water meter. We can see that for the annual volumetric bill, if this customer was charged on a per cubic meter basis currently, would increase from $522 to $680 by 2024, an increase of about 9% per year on average. The average annual bill for the per fixture charge increasing from $992 to approximately $1,150, an increase of 5% per year. In 2025, we would see all customers move to the uniform metered rate structure, in which they would have an annual base rate, which would increase from $540 for the 2-inch meter up to $2,862 by 2030, and a volumetric component of that bill, which would increase from $680 to $703. And so what that means for this type of customer is that if they are currently paying a metered rate, over the 10-year period, they would see average annual increases of about 24%. If they're currently paying a per fixture charge, they would see average annual increases over that entire 10-year period of about 15%. And then just to further illustrate the differences in how these impacts might be seen for different customers, I have two separate comparisons on the next 2 slides for non-residential customers. This first comparison being for 2 customers that both currently pay a flat rate structure. Customer number 1, who consumes 30 cubic meters per year. Customer number 2, who consumes 650 meters per year, as we saw in one of the earlier comparisons. Their bills would be the same until 2024 at about a 5% annual increase. But then with the change to the metered rate structure, we would see customer number 2, who consumes about 20 times as much water as customer number 1, their bill would increase by almost 300%. Customer number 2 would increase by about 61% in 2025. Next slide. And then lastly, in terms of the comparisons of customer types, here looking at two non-residential customers with both having a 3-inch water meter and consuming 10,000 cubic meters of water per year. Customer number 1 currently being charged on a flat rate basis, customer number 2 on a metered rate basis. Their rates over the period of 2024 would increase as per the increase in the current rates, 5% per year for the flat rate customer number 1, about 9% per year for the metered rate customer. But then in 2025, we would see that this flat rate customer, customer number 1, actually have a decrease, a 52% decrease in their bill, and then both customers would increase by about 6% annually thereafter. So just with those residential and non-residential customers, just again to sort of bring home the point that on average, residential customers would see a decrease in their water bills. Non-residential on average would see an increase, but the specific impacts will vary by individual customer. So then to further assess the competitiveness and affordability of the current and proposed water and wastewater rates within the city, we surveyed 225 municipalities in the province that have both water and wastewater services. And the median annual water and wastewater bill for those residential customers consuming about 200 cubic meters of water per year on a 5/8 or 3/4 inch meter was about $1,160. About 57% higher than the average residential bill in Cornwall, which is $740 per year. And as we can see, when we look at the range of those municipalities in terms of what that current bill is, only about 10% of the 225 municipalities, but 23 of them have bills below $800, where the city would currently be placed. The majority of the municipalities having charges between $800 and $1,200 per year for residential water and wastewater services, with some municipalities charging over $2,000 per year. And then focusing in a little bit more closely on Eastern Ontario municipalities, for the same residential comparison, towards the bottom of the comparison on the right-hand side, we can see that the average residential bill currently in the city of $740 would place the city third lowest in this comparison, just above that of North and South Stormont, but below Ottawa, as identified by the gray arrow. With the move to the proposed metered water rates in 2025, as presented by the middle blue arrow, we would see the city move above that of Ottawa and South Dundas. And then by 2030, they would maintain that position as identified by the left-hand arrow. The right-hand arrow, green arrow, shows where the city would then be placed in 2032 when the $80 annual meter installation charge is no longer applicable. And so at that time, in comparison to the current position, above that only of Ottawa. What's also really important to note here in this comparison is that we're comparing rates that would be imposed in the city in 2025, 2030, and 2032, and these rates being inclusive of inflation. And so what would be expected is that the rates in the other municipalities are going to also be increased over that period, and if the annual bills for the other municipalities increased at that median level of 4% per year, the city would continue to maintain their current position and might actually even decrease below that of North Stormont, depending on the increases seen in the other municipalities. And then for non-residential water and wastewater bills, so looking at a an average customer of 450 cubic meters with a 1-inch meter installed on the properties. For the metered customers in Cornwall, metered non-residential customers, their bill would be about $533. That compares to the median rate or bill in the province for the same customer type of $2,102, almost 4 times as much as what is currently being imposed in the city. And as well, we can see that the majority of municipalities charge somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000 per year for that customer type. And then again, looking at the Eastern Ontario municipalities that have been surveyed for this purpose, on the right-hand side, we can see that the current metered customer, non-residential customers in the city would be at the bottom end of the comparison, and those paying a fixture rate, the average fixture rate for the non-residential customers would be above only that of North Stormont. With the move to the metered rates in 2025, this average non-residential customer would still be at the bottom end of the comparison, above only that of North Stormont, as identified by the right-hand blue arrow. By 2030, that position would increase towards the mid-range of the comparison, as identified by the left-hand blue arrow, below that of North Glengarry and Castleman, but above a number of the other neighboring municipalities. But what's also important to note, as I mentioned with the residential comparison, is that when we're looking at the left-hand, the 2 left-hand arrows in 2030 and 2032, that's in comparison to annual bills in current dollars in the other municipalities. And if the rates were to increase at that median level of about 4.2%, the city would be above only that of, or would be above only that of North Stormont. Again, if the other municipalities increase their rates at those median provincial levels. So just to identify that it is a comparison of future costs in the city to current costs in other municipalities. So lastly, in terms of the next steps, firstly, if council is to provide direction to proceed with the universal meter installation program, the city will be issuing a request for proposal to commission a qualified consulting firm to provide some dedicated project management services that were related to the design of the technology and water meter installation program, developing approaches for the procurement of that of those services and oversee that process, and then ongoing project management, quality assurance, and risk mitigation in commissioning the automatic metering system. Then there will be continued outreach to promote and educate the community about the benefits of water conservation, about the forthcoming water meter installations, as well as the rate structure charges. Next slide. And then as we touched on earlier, there'll be the non-residential consultation around the proposed water rates and the potential water conservation rebates and incentives specific to their industries. The water conservation program will be finalized and that will begin to be implemented, including the home water audits and the residential toilet program, beginning the installation of the water meters under the dedicated program manager. And then the waterworks bylaw will also need to be updated to include a provision that the new builds will have to purchase their water meter through the building permit process. And then as that water meter installation program commences, the city will be monitoring the increased water consumption data that they do receive, and using that information to make any revisions or updates to the proposed water and wastewater rates prior to their anticipated implementation in 2025. So thank you for bearing with me. I know that was a lot of information in one presentation, but we did feel it's helpful to sort of go through that full process that the city has proceeded through.
Thank you for the presentation. Now, for the purpose of process tonight, I'm just wondering if it would be, I imagine there may be councillors that want to speak more than once, so if we could pass a motion to bypass the procedural bylaw to allow you to speak more than once, you can speak twice, so a motion of that could be in order right now. And Councillor McDonald?
I'd like to make that motion, please, Mr.
Okay, it
Mayor.
would be a maximum of twice, right? Is there a seconder? Councillor Hebert? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Okay, again, thank you for the presentation. I think there's a number of questions. I know I have some, but I'm looking for questions. Councillor Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can we go back to what I have as page 37? Sorry. The one where you show the median increase from 2014 to 2020. Cornwall is 3.2%, and the median in the province is 4.2%. Yep. The next slide, you're using 5% as the annual percentage increase over the next 9 years. Where does that number come from?
That number came from the 2020 water and wastewater rate study, in where we looked at the forecast water and wastewater rates under your current rate structure to provide for the full operating life cycle cost of the systems.
So that's our own number,
Yes.
at 5%. But traditionally, over the last 6 years, we've been lower than the provincial median, which does use, for the most part, meters.
Yes, and so just to clarify, the 5% is what's being recommended to bring you to rates that recover your full operating life cycle costs. When we're looking at what has been done in the city historically, as well as in other municipalities, that does not mean either the city or those other municipalities are increasing their rates to full cost recovery levels.
Right, okay. I mean, I would have stayed with the 3.2. It seems to change those numbers quite a bit, but thank you for answering the question.
Any other questions? Councillor Hollingsworth?
Questions. First of all, if we went ahead with this, I don't know if I missed it, but are you recommending like the declining block, the inverted block, the consistent one? Which one? Because it doesn't say in the recommendation what one we would be potentially implementing. Now, if I got it right, the inverted block would probably promote the most water conservation. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
So my point is, in the recommendation, assuming that council said yes, let's go ahead, which one are we using?
So what's being recommended is to use the constant rate per cubic meter, and the reason not to move to an inverted block rate at this time, for example, is because the fact that the city does not have the detailed consumption data by individual property. It's difficult to set where those thresholds should be of where the rates increase without having potentially some unintended consequences on different customers of where that block is set.
Fair enough, then that question perhaps, Your Worship, with your indulgence to Mr. tackle it, could we eventually, is it a big reach to go to the inverted block, let's say 5 years after we install meters and begin to collect data? Is it a big reach to go to that other suggested number? Or is it once we're doing this, we're kind of committed? I'm not sure what I think, I just.
My microphone's not working, but I'll yell a little bit. Okay. In my opinion, it would not be. Because once we have the information, and because we have an automated system, and I say it guardedly because I know there's some implications at the financial end, but if council the day wanted to go to the declining block, then I'm sure it could be accommodated.
Okay. One more question then. So if I'm a landlord who go to meters and I tried to, and I read the report and I'm, if I'm a landlord and we're at meters, is the landlord then obliged to pay for each apartment separately and then technically transfer that cost back like in the form of rent? How are we managing on what you guys' property? Let's say a fourplex as an example.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, with regard to a fourplex, there's a number of, or I'll just use a fourplex.
Sure.
It could be that the landlord would have one meter and charge the individual, the group, if you will, although I wouldn't find that equitable.
I wouldn't be on board, no.
Right. But it's possible they could do that because much the same is being done with a heating bill or
Sure.
perhaps what's being done with a electrical bill now. So they charge a flat rate to cover it all. But the other alternative, of course, is that the landlord would have to pay for the installation of 4 meters and then charge the individual apartments or units according to what they use.
And he's likely going to try to recoup the cost of those meters in his rent.
Similarly, through you, Mr. Mayor, similarly with gas,
Sure, I
similarly with
understand.
electrical.
Fair enough. And the last one, a question, on page 40 of the agenda 37 of the report for the presentation, same page, you just have it. Now, you have, if I'm reading this correctly, so you've got 3 municipalities at 1% and 19 municipalities at 2% and then 17 at 3%, 4%, so we're at 3.2%. Those other municipalities that are at that 4.2%, the majority of them, are they on meters or are they flat rates?
I would have to confirm for the 85 municipalities within this study, but the majority would be on meters, as the majority of all municipalities in the province are on meters.
Okay, thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, gentlemen.
Councillor McIntosh?
I have several questions, so I'll break this up, some of them in round 2. I wasn't impressed with the report. Thought it was, you had to come to a conclusion and you're trying to sell us water meters. The wording sometimes, I noticed they said the opposition of water meters, people believed that the cost would go up, but those who were in favor, belief was a misleading term, I think. They don't know what they're talking about. The rates are going to go down, they don't know that. We started out with a water conservation plan and led off with the conclusion that we had to have water meters. The borrowing money, $15 million to pay for the water meters. I would like to know from, maybe Tracy doesn't have the, what does it cost to borrow $15 million? What would be our total cost? Interest, principal and interest.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if the city would borrow about $15 million at 3% over 20 years, it would cost about just under $5 million, so just under $20 million.
So we're talking about 20 million, not 15. Yeah.
Our plan would be to, if we did move ahead and install water meters, we would borrow 17.1 million. That would be added to all of the other capital works that the city sees in its 10-year forecast. So there was a slide that showed the city contributing to reserves and funding its capital in that manner.
Yeah, okay. I'm just concerned with borrowing 15 to 20 for this. We're going to borrow 10 million for the fire station. We're going to borrow 5 million over here, there. You know, you can say the province sets a limit, saying 25% or whatever. I get notices from my Visa card all the time telling me they can raise my limit. You know, go ahead and do it. You got to pay the bill at the end of the day. So I'm really concerned about the added debt. Another thing too is you talk about cost saving due to reduced water use, 300,000 per year. How do you arrive at that number?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Essentially what happens is we're treating less water that has to be going through the wastewater, through the water plant, and as well through the wastewater plant, because water coming into the system has to be treated going out, back into the river. And that costs money in terms of electrical and in terms of chemicals. And so if we reduce the amount of water we're treating at both ends, then we're anticipating, you know, a savings of approximately $300,000 a
Yeah.
year.
So it's anticipation. It's not there's no financial statement here. It's, we could save 300,000. We may not save 300,000, might save more. Is that,
That's a number based on the
Yeah.
anticipated reduction in water due to, you know, people conserving the water at the household and at the industrial level as well.
Okay.
Industrial, commercial, institutional.
Okay, another, just took a quick note here. Some people use 22 times more than others. How do we know that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we currently have meters at all industrial, commercial, institutional locations.
But not residential,
Sorry?
not residential.
No, but we're talking primarily with regard to industrial, commercial, institutional. I think that's the comparison you're talking
Is that what you,
about.
okay, I misunderstood that then.
Sorry?
I thought you had some way, you were saying you could read how much the average person's using in a year. I'm just wondering, how do you arrive at that if they don't have meters?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, what we've done in this particular case, thank you. And I'll just let Sean Michael confirm what I'm about to say, but what we've done is we know exactly how much the industrial, commercial, institutional group are using in terms, because all of them are metered, and then we subtract the difference, right? And that's how we know, on average, what the average household in Cornwall is using.
Okay, that sounds reasonable, Bill. In communities that have meters, you talk about a fixed rate. Well, you know, I don't use any power. I go to Florida. I still have a bill coming in that says, here's what you owe us, even though you didn't use any power. So when you talk about a fixed rate for the meter, there's a rate you pay, and then you pay usage on top of that, right?
That's correct.
Okay. I lost my train of thought here. Okay, yeah, here's what I want to think. Why do I read, now, the increases I hear from other cities, like Ottawa keeps talking about how consumption dropped, they got to raise their rates. Are they raising the base rate, or are they raising the rate they charge for consumption?
It would depend. So if consumption dropped and therefore they had a reduction in revenue associated with a lower consumption and their consumptive rates, if they did not see a corresponding decrease in costs, then they would have a revenue shortfall, and so they would need to raise their rates, and it would be up to them to decide how they're going to recover that revenue shortfall, whether that's through an increase in their base rate or an increase in their consumptive rate.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you what they did specifically.
Okay, just that I follow, reading North Bay, Kingston, whatnot, newspapers when it comes out budget time, it seems every year, they say, or not every year, but we had a big drop in consumption, so we have to raise the rate because it's all based on revenue. We sell water. And I think some of it, you're really crystal gaze, or you're taking a guess at what the rates could go up. You really don't know for sure. You're telling us that 2% here, 5% there. That's a guess, isn't it?
So the rate forecast
Yeah.
is based on the forecast water demand and the forecast capital and operating costs. So I wouldn't characterize it as a guess. It is the capital costs are based on the city's 10-year plan and their asset management plan needs. The operating costs are based on your current cost with inflation added in, plus an estimate for reductions related to changes in demand. And then the water demand, somewhat to your point, is based on a targeted level of residential water consumption with conservation. And so actual water use will, of course, differ from what is forecasted, and there will be municipalities are continually making interim corrections or updates to their rate forecast in response to changes in customer behavior.
Yeah, sort of like what economists do with the economy. They give us an estimate, and sometimes they're on, sometimes they're off. I want to go back to the survey. That 328 residents responded to the survey.
Correct?
Rick Nanis would not be impressed. That's a very small number. Would you agree with me?
It was less than 2% of the city's population.
We usually try for 1,000. And 60% of those suggested that they prefer a user rate.
No, that's
No,
not correct.
not true? Okay.
No, 60% suggested that they did not want user rates.
Did not want user rates, okay. But either, no matter what side of the argument you're on, those are small numbers, and really, I wouldn't rely too much on them.
No, so as we identify in the report, the results are not statistically significant. They're utilized to inform the opinions and trends from the survey.
Okay. And when it comes to things like toilet rebate programs, we can have that without meters, can we not? It's just part of a water conservation program without meters.
You could, yes. The individual would not see any reductions to their water bill as a result of lower water conservation associated with having a lower use toilet, though.
Yeah, but if you're an environmentalist or you believe in the environment, you might think it's your duty to help reduce waste. I'll come back to a couple of other things, okay, rather than prolong this.
Thank you. Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I just want to go back to the beginning and clarify. We're having this discussion because obviously the provincial government is encouraging everybody to have a water conservation program, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and they don't specify a metered system, but there's simply no other tangible system that we could imagine that we could use, right?
Potentially, there are things you could do to encourage water conservation. What they also recommend what's also part of the recommendations is that you are able to audit the effectiveness of your water conservation program.
Yeah.
And so that you're not really able to do without water meters.
Right. So I've heard in some discussion over the years that initially when people do have water meters installed, they become very conscious of their water usage and they cut back. But then over a given period of time, their usage goes back to what it was. Now, we probably don't have any way of really knowing that because if we're not metered to start with, we really can't tell. But regardless, our duty is to have some sort of way of auditing people's water use, and simply knowing how much you're using encourages people to conserve, I guess.
Yeah, in part, knowing how much you use encourages you to conserve, but that needs to be in concert with the billing structure and the manner in which you're charged for those services.
Yeah. And then, did you say we and Timmins are the cities, only the biggest cities of our size who have not yet gone to a meter system? Everybody else our size and up has?
That's correct.
That's really scary. So, like, this has, in a sense, been kind of a sleeper issue, but when you put it that way, like the pressure's on if the rest of the province is complying, and we haven't yet, I would say, right?
Yeah, like I don't know whether it's a matter of compliance if you don't move to a metered system, but in terms of best practices within the province and moving towards at least complying with the recommendations of the ministry, is water meters is the approach that most municipalities have used.
Right. And I would expect that when you hear a lot of the droughts and that sort of thing that are occurring as a result of climate change, that currents has sharpens the edge as well. But sadly, because we live beside this mighty St. Lawrence, which is a huge, our water source, maybe locally we haven't reacted as strongly as we should have to the fact that we need to conserve. It's sort of lost on us. Anyway, I think it sounds like where we should go soon.
Councillor Gardner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Although I agree with the report, I think it's a really good report, and I seconded it and originally to get the information that we need. But as I went through this report twice, and during that time, I kept coming back to 2022, 2024, non-residential will increase 10%. That's in the report, right? So, Mike.
If I may, that's for the non-residential customers who are currently paying a metered rate only.
Yeah.
Not the non-residential customers who are currently paying a per fixture rate.
Okay. So, according to what you just said a few minutes ago, there's an increase of 10%, 2022 to 2024.
That's correct for the metered non-residential customers.
That's correct. Right now, we're in the middle of COVID, and we have businesses, and part of the report talks about restaurants. We have restaurants that are just about ready to go out of business and close up shop. They're done because they can't afford it. They don't have the customers. They don't have the workers. So for me, given that the COVID's, we're not out of that yet, I would defer this for at least a year or two, going forward with this for a year or two, because of non-residential. But in residential, again, my mind kept going back to COVID, thinking there are people that are going to lose their homes soon because they lost their job during COVID. They just don't have the money to be able to support the house. And we have a problem with homelessness here, and it's getting worse. And when I hear and I read that families can no longer afford to stay in their homes, that bothers me. And so again, I look at that and I think I need to defer that for at least a year or two until things begin to stabilize. In terms of money, I think the CAO has always heard me say that I worry, no matter whether the province cares or not, it says we can owe $2 billion or whatever the hell we can afford to. When we get up to around $65 million in debt, which is going to be close because the entire package is going to cost 17.1, 14.6% for meters, but the balance is services and stuff like that. Now I'm looking at 17.1. I think Councillor McIntosh made a point of other borrowings that are coming, or we don't have a Cornwall Electric to sell anymore. We sold that for $65 million. I've said that before, but we're at that point now. What are we, right now, if you add the 17.1% or 14.6, whatever, to our debt now, what interest are we paying on that money? And it's the taxpayers that are paying the interest on that. So I was put in this seat by the taxpayers, and right now I want to protect them. I want to protect their assets. I want to lower their taxes if I can. I don't want to borrow so much money that our taxes go up to pay the interest. That's where I am right now. The cost of early leak detection, we have meters throughout our system, not at homes. And we know we're losing money there, or water there, and that's taken care of. The next thing that came to mind was 2032 will be finished paying the initial cost for meters. What's going to be the cost of new meters? Because after 12 years, 10 years, 11 years, those meters need to be replaced. So here we go with another $14 million if we have to replace them. So when does it stop? That's my issue. When does it stop? When do we stop borrowing money and start saving money and lowering the taxes like we said we were going to do when we were elected? I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, it took so long, but the one more comment I have to make, when I see comparisons being made with South Glengarry, with South Stormont, I want to see comparisons done with Belleville, with Aurora, with North Bay, which are cities our size, so that we can compare apples to apples. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for allowing me to.
Any other questions? Oh. Councillor Carr?
First of all, I'm sorry I was late, but I was in the shower.
Your mic's off.
It's on now? Okay. When we look at this report and you talk about residential and commercial, are there any persons or organizations that are not included in the statistics and information you've given us?
No, all ratepayers within the city are included within the analysis.
But do we, I could be wrong, but do we give, or do we sell, or do we provide water to any of the surrounding municipalities?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, we do sell water to South Stormont, and we have a small quantity going to South Glengarry.
But that's not mentioned anywhere in the report, so but it has an impact on the city of Cornwall. Because I don't think we sell that water at profit, we sell it at what it supposedly cost us, right?
My understanding, through you, Mr. Mayor, my understanding is that we have an agreement in place, and I'm sorry, I can't tell you if we, to my understanding is we are recovering our costs.
But you can't tell me what it is. And it was not part of the report.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I do not believe it was, the consumptions, the numbers were included, but I don't think there was and Sean Michael can confirm this, but I don't believe that the revenue portion of the numbers that we were, the funding that we received from South Glengarry, or from those two municipalities, are included in the financial portion of the calculation.
And they're aware of this report we have and the work that's going on, because right now they don't expect an increase in the cost of providing water to their residents.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we did not speak to them about this. However, we set the rates at the end of the day, and certainly if we're adamant about recovering costs, they're going to have to pay.
Okay. Municipally, would the fire department be on this program?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of the amount of water that they use? Is that what
Yeah,
you're
if
suggesting?
this is a major fire in the city, fire department comes and uses water, do we then go after in the future, will we go after the insurance they have to say, or will we encourage people to be insured against having to use a lot of water supply? There's a lot of,
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I would suspect that we should, but I can assure you that at this point in time, I do not believe that that's recovered.
Oh, right now, I don't think it is, but I'm saying in the future, would it be covered? Okay, it brings up all kinds of questions, and we could be here all night asking, and I appreciate your presentation. It was very informative, and I look forward to more discussions about this particular issue. So that's all the questions I have at this moment. Thank you.
Councillor Towndale?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, thank you for the presentation, very detailed. Took a few days to read it and to absorb it. A lot of the issues I would have raised or questions I had have been asked and answered. Do reiterate a point made by Councillor Gardner about some of the businesses in certain sectors that are struggling right now that might use a lot of water. So to see potential increases in the next 3 to 4 years, the 10% range is a little concerning. But one issue I'll focus on right now has to do more with talking about the rebates that we'd be looking to offer and whatnot. Read the proposal for what we could do. I looked at the chart that was provided at the very end that talked about what other municipalities do. And truthfully, I think if we want buy-in, we need to do more. At least that's my take on it. I think $50 for energy efficient toilets or water efficient toilets, sure, it's great. But then something that occurred to me, we charge a dumping fee for toilets at the landfill. So we're gonna have people replace their toilets and we're gonna charge them $10 when they get to landfill with the toilet because we don't take them at the curb. So, if we really want people to buy into this, I think we have to waive that if they replace their toilet. Otherwise, it just seems like we're saying, oh yeah, replace your toilet, we'll give you $50, but you gotta give $10 back right away. I think we should look at other appliances. I don't know about, I'm not an expert in faucets and how that all works for water flow, but rain barrels, that kind of thing, I think that's something we should be looking at, because if we really want people to buy into water meters, and I support water meters, I'll just say that right now, we have to make it easy for transitions. So toilets is one thing, sure, but things like rain barrels make a difference too. I think we need to go all in with this. But I did have a question, because in the report, it does say that there'd be a limit put in per residence. It's on page 4-4 of the report. I think it's page 100 of the actual agenda. There would also be a limit on number of rebates per home, i.e. 2 per home. Can I ask the reasoning behind that? For example, my parents' house, they have 3 toilets. So, if they decided to get a low flow toilet and then they can't do all 3, they would do 2 and that's it. I think that's almost self-defeating, because you're leaving certain things unfinished there. There's no incentive to continue, and there are homes here that have 4 bathrooms, 5 bathrooms, et cetera, so forth. So what's the reasoning for the limit on the rebate?
So the rationale for the limit is kind of twofold. One part is informed by the municipal practice, in which there typically is a limit of 1 or 2 per home. And then what feeds into that is the benefits you see from reduced water usage. Obviously, there's only so much use of regardless of how many toilets you have in a home, there's only so many flushes per day. And so the policies were developed somewhat to focus on the priority toilets, if you will, in terms of where that usage is within a home, and with regard for the fact that typically these conservation programs are provided within a set budget limitation, and so to allow that the municipality's budget for those programs to be available to more households, so that if you're limiting the number of toilets per home, potentially there's more households within the city or within the municipality that can access that budget for the conservation program.
Thank you. Through Mr. Mayor, if we're setting aside $100,000 a year for toilets, that's a lot of toilets every year. I think we should get rid of the limit. Again, if we want people to buy in, I think we have to make it easy. And we have to do things like that to really encourage it. Otherwise, I'm not sure about the pickup. I mean, there's been comments here tonight that reflect, I think, the attitude in general on moving forward. So, I really think it needs to be user-friendly at the end of it. Thank you.
Just, is anybody else in the first round?
Just on a point of order, Your Worship, do you want some motions to be made?
No, these are just questions for the,
Okay, so in terms of our first and second rounds, do we get another round after the motion is made, or is our second round?
there's
like our-
two motions, right?
Yes, so I guess I want to know what I'm going to be, when I'm going to, if I don't really have anything else to say, I'd rather just make a motion and debate, but my point
Oh,
is, in
just get-
terms of procedure, how do you want to move
I think
on?
we'll have questions right now for clarification, and then we'll debate the motions when they come.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll stick to questions about the presentation. Do you know if there's any other cities in those 85, just offhand, that do like a hybrid model where businesses are metered and residents are not? Is there any city that comes to mind that does that? Was that considered as an option, I suppose, as well?
I'm not aware of any others that use that hybrid approach, and no, it was not considered as an option because of the current inequity between residential and non-residential that currently exists as a result of that hybrid structure that you currently employ.
Okay, sorry, can you say that part again?
So currently you have, within your non-residential sector, you have the customers are metered. Some of them are charged using a metered rate, while your residential customers are charged on a flat rate basis. What we've seen is that the residential customers pay a disproportionate share of the cost relative to the demand for service, and part of that is as a result of this hybrid model that the city currently imposes.
Thank you.
I just have a couple of questions. When you talked about the size of the meter, you had 5/8, 3/4, 1 inch, 2 inch. How does that impact anything in the equation?
So what's proposed in the rate structure is that there would be a monthly base fee that would be paid regardless of consumption, and that fee would be based on the size of your meter. And so the larger the meter you have, potentially the greater demand on the system you have as well, and the greater capacity in the system that had to have been created and provided. And so customers with larger meter sizes would pay a larger monthly fixed component to their bill.
Okay, so hypothetically speaking, I had a half-inch line coming into my house from outside. So how do I get from? So I'm restricted. I can only put in a half-inch meter, right? Or 5/8, depending on how you measure it.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So there is a reference to 5/8 meters. So back in, I would say, and I can't say when, but recently, or up till recently, the standard was a 5/8 meter. Now the standard is a 3/4 inch meter. So the smallest meter is being made is a 3/4 inch meter. So with regard to your line, it's just spliced in, and the volume of water that goes through, regardless if it's an inch or a half-inch line or up to a 3/4 inch line, because that's what most residential services have now. Some of the older homes in the city still have a half-inch line, but the standard now is 3/4. And so we'll simply, in this example, a 3/4 inch meter will simply be spliced onto the half-inch line, and whatever it goes through is read.
But it's still volume, right?
It's still volume, yes.
So what I'm referring to is it's stagnant until somebody opens a tap somewhere else, right? So I guess I'm having trouble with the residential part with those meters and the cost associated with it. Because water is stagnant until you make it flow.
That is correct, whether there's a meter there or not.
Right. So I'm just trying to understand how I can explain this to residents. The size of the meter is going to be impacting your costs.
So in terms of residential, the base-sized meter would be a 3/4 inch, and we would have a fixed rate associated with that 3/4 inch. Generally, in the industrial or non-residential sector, industrial, commercial, institutional, depending on the amount of water that the individual business is going to use, we would have to upsize their service pipe, of course, and then based on that service pipe, we would put in a similarly sized meter. So if you had a 1-inch line or a 2-inch line coming into the business, because you need that volume going through the pipe, then we put on a 2-inch meter.
Okay. The next question, currently non-residential are all metered, aren't they?
That is correct.
So I don't understand, why would they get increased costs? Because currently they're being metered, they're being measured for, through meters now, and why would their cost increase?
So there's a little bit of history behind all of this. And I'm going to say that approximately in Cornwall, and I can stand to be corrected, but I'm pretty close, that there are in the order of 1,100 industrial, commercial, institutional establishments, and all of them have meters, but out of that 1,100, and again, I stand to be corrected exact numbers, but about 330 are charged on a metered rate, while the remainder are charged on a flat rate. And it's just the way things happened over history. That we started a program many years ago, and they started putting in meters, and we started a metered rate for those businesses. But then, for some reason, I can't explain why, it stopped, and the remainder stayed on flat rate per fixture rates, while the 330 plus or minus stayed on the metered rate. And so this is what Sean Michael was talking about, the inequity of the business we have. And I'll give you an example. We have a franchise restaurant, and you can decide what that name is, in the east end of Cornwall, with a metered and being charged a metered rate, and not using a great deal of, or using a great deal of water, and being charged X amount of money, while that same franchise restaurant on the west end of Cornwall is on a fixture rate and paying not the same. So, but yet using the same volume of water. So you can see there's inequities that we really need to address.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, so we've got two items. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So in terms of strategy, I really like that idea that Councillor Towndale said of, for example, with the low-flow toilets, start now. Because if, like, the sooner we start and the smaller steps we take at the beginning, the less this is going to seem like something really major and hard to handle, and, you know, we can't afford it and all this. Like, in terms of public resistance, I think the sooner we start, and with the very popular move, it's going to make the whole thing easier. But secondly, after having said that, my question is, you mentioned rain harvesting gray water, and I think I know what you mean, but I'm not sure. So do you mind explaining those two terms?
So rain harvesting was referring to what the one councillor mentioned in terms of rain barrels, for example, would be rain harvesting. Gray water reuse is systems that are installed that take water use, wastewater from certain areas of the home and reuse it, for example, in your toilet. So it's water that's already gone through your faucet. Instead of contributing it back to the sewer system, there's a system that would then, this is what they call gray water, then contribute it into your toilet to be used for flushing the toilet. So couldn't be used for human consumption. Could be from the dishwasher, potentially. I'd have to, I don't have the specifics on which which types of uses, can be plumbed into a gray water system, but that's the principle that you're taking lightly used water and then using it in non-consumption areas of the home.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Councillor Gardner.
Yeah, to your point, the report says that 33% of the water used is by non-residents, and they pay 17% of the cost. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that's the inequity. So how do we balance that? How are we going to balance that?
So that is what the proposed rate structure is doing over the period of 2030, is by charging all residents and businesses with the same rate structure. Is that then that eliminates the inequities that are a result of the different types of rate structures imposed.
Okay, so that goes back to what I said before. The restaurants are going to take a beating right now. Thank you.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just one quick question. Did I not read that we're 36% higher consumption than the average municipality in the province of Ontario? Is that number then correct, or have I got that?
Your current, what we've estimated to be your current average household consumption
Sure.
is 269 cubic meters per household. What the targeted level is with the water conservation program is 203 cubic meters per household. That 203 cubic meters is 36% higher than the average household in Ontario.
Thank
so
you.
your current use is obviously higher than that.
Fair enough. Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor McIntosh.
I'd like to apologize first for being maybe overly critical of the report, but some things. Shawn Michaels, you're not related to the wrestler, are you? Okay. There's going to be winners and losers in this. And for me, my wife and I, home alone, probably won't pay any more, or might pay a little bit more. But a family of 5 with 3 teenagers, they're going to pay a lot more. That's one of the downsides to this the meter system. I'm glad you cleared up the compliance issue. That was stated at this council meeting in the last term, and it was implied that the province was urging us, forcing us to go to meters, and I was later told by somebody on the know that that wasn't true. They wanted a water conservation plan, and I guess meters are tied into that, but there wasn't any pressure on us or the municipality to bring meters in or else. No. So I'm glad you referred to it wasn't a compliance issue.
That's my understanding. I would defer to city staff if there's been any direct direction in terms of installing meters.
Yeah. I suspect that somewhere down the line, meters are probably going to come in. I took the approach to this. I'm from Missouri. Prove it to me. I didn't think you convinced me yet. So take a look at it down the road. And a lot of people think that their water bill is immediately going to drop, and they're going to save all this money. And I'm always skeptical of forecasts, whether they're economic forecasts or like your forecasts. Be nice if it happened, but again, it's a crystal ball issue. And when it comes to water conservation, there's a misconception out there that people in certain parts of the city run their sprinklers 24/7. I don't think that's true. There might be a couple of individuals maybe do it, but overall, I think most people are conscious of the water conservation. I got the rain barrel thing and the whole bit. Every time there's a heavy rainstorm, I can fill it up with, and I use it for my garden. So I guess we'll go from here and see what happens.
Well, where are we going from here? We're going to have a motion to receive the report. Councillor Hollingsworth, second by Councillor Gardner. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Second motion is that council will approve the universal installation of water meters at all water service connections throughout the city of Cornwall. and implement the water conservation program as outlined in the Water Conservation and Servicing Master Plan prepared by Watson and Associates. Councillor Gardner, or Hollingsworth, are you moving that motion?
Yeah, I'll make the motion as it's recommended, Your Worship.
Second. Councillor McDonald. Questions? Councillor Hollingsworth.
I don't really have a question so much, Your Worship, as a point of debate. I think we talk about cost and whether it's going to save people money and or not save people money, and Councillor McIntosh makes a valid point that there's a certain degree of estimating based on what we think we know. I'm not really necessarily convinced that the average ratepayer in Cornwall is going to necessarily save money if we go to meters, but that's not my kind of angle on this. I'm thinking more grandiose, on a grandiose perspective, and that is in the early 90s or mid 90s, we had this very same discussion and everybody said, oh, it's too expensive, we shouldn't do it, we can't afford it, and council just didn't even get off the ground. But the truth of the matter is the environment is under siege. There's reports on every length, whether it's climate change, and every time we use water, treat it and pump it back into the water system, we're changing water, which means we're potentially changing the environment. And I think anytime we're going to potentially change the environment, that's not really a good thing. So government sometimes has to bite the bullet, even though it may not be what everybody wants, to try and do the whole environment thing, because sooner or later I believe it's going to come back to haunt us. Maybe not me, but probably my grandkids, if I have some, if my kids get on board, they're going to have to potentially face that reality, and I think that I have a duty to them to try to do the right thing. The other thing that has been identified is we have a gross inequity in our system between non-res versus res, and between res versus res, in the sense that we charge people based on taps, which means a family of 5 who has 5 taps but only uses a little bit of water is subsidizing the family of 5 who uses a ton of water but only has a few taps. It's a grossly inconsistent, flawed system, and 85% of the municipalities in the province have already acknowledged that and recognized that and gone to a metered system because it is more consistent, more reliable, and more predictable sort of way of measuring. Ultimately, Your Worship, I don't really want to spend $17 million any more than anybody else around this table does. Make no mistake about that. But I think if we're interested in the environment, which I am, and we're interested in fairness, which I am, we have to kind of bite the bullet and push forward on this, which is why I made the motion in the first place to get the information, which is why I'm supporting the recommendation as it is right now. Thank you.
Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I support the recommendation too, but I do have a question, because the discussion of people paying more or less and people paying unfairly will inevitably be used as kind of a counter-argument. A few years ago, in one of these earlier bouts of experimentation and consideration of water meters, residents were offered the option of having a meter installed in their house, and I, for one, volunteered my house. And I've moved out of that house now, so I'm not looking at the meter in any way. But I didn't even read it then. But I wondered, as part of that program, was the city monitoring what people were using?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, we did, in fact,
good.
read
Okay,
all,
so-
we know generally we know exactly what everybody uses, and I think, and again, I think Mr. O'Keefe could confirm, but it's in the order of 1,000 meters we put out there, and we did read them all, and we knew exactly what people were using. My only comment to it is that there was no incentive, if you will, to not to use any less water because the meter was there.
Yeah.
For
okay.
most.
So in a sense, though, we at least have a
I
sense
think
then
this,
of not just
Elaine,
put-
I think the gentleman has a
Through you, Mr. Mayor, Mr. DeWitt is correct. There is approximately 1,100 water meters in single-family residential homes, and we did collect usage readings off that. They are all radio reads, so we didn't need to access the residents' homes to read them. We just have to drive down the street and get the values. So we do collect that data and do have that available.
Great.
Thank you.
Because it gives us a sense that, you know, we don't really have to be going blindly here when we say the commercial rate is sometimes metered, and we have the advantage of knowing what they use, whereas with residents, it's not so. But actually, in 1,100 residential cases, it is so. We can measure it. But two things. When we go ahead, I think we should look at all the different steps, and let's start with the steps that might be most palatable to people. Like, for example, I think the low-flow toilet, because it's pretty popular among people to have a low-flow toilet, and, you know, people make that move and appreciate it. And secondly, as far as people, like a family of 5 being disadvantaged if we start going metering, well, a family of 5 right now is paying for the non-residential users who aren't paying their fair share. So if, in fact, this reduces the rate for residences, which obviously it will, if the non-residences will be paying a greater share, well, then the family of 5 might not be paying more in the future than they pay now, because now they're subsidizing the, not just other residences, but they're subsidizing non-residential uses, like the restaurants and hotels and industries in the city. So it's just, you know, when we hear all these objections, we have to, I think we as councillors, because we're going to be the point people on it, we have to have as much rationale as we can ready to respond to people. Because, you know, I'll be blunt, when you tell people if we do this, they're going to pay less in the future, somehow that just seems like a Barnum and Bailey circus thing, you know, like we're going to bring in this $17 million program that's going to cost you less. It's just a hard sell, but I believe it. But I mean, when you're talking to people in the coffee shop or whatever, that's the kind of thing people just scoff at. So we have to be committed advocates of this system, which I hope we will do. I certainly propose to do, and I support this change with hopefully some strategic steps built in.
Councilor Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will not support that recommendation. I'm just as much a conservationist as anybody around this table. However, for me, I don't want to see one restaurant closed because of the increase. They're already on the cusp of shutting down. I don't want to see anyone losing a house in this city. I would much prefer to have this deferred for a year or maybe 2 until the economy stabilizes. I'm in favor of the recommendation, but I don't want to vote for it because there are extenuated circumstances that I don't think are fair to our restaurateurs or our homeowners, especially those that are on the cusp of losing everything.
Councilor Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a question, I suppose, on order. There's 2 items in this motion, really. If this is defeated, can we still implement a water conservation program? Because to me, they're not tied together. They are in this report, but they're 2 very different things.
So who's going to answer the question?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Certainly, if that's a motion that's put forward, we're going to follow the lead of council.
Okay. I'll run with that, I suppose. Listen, from what I know of the order of motions and such, these are just 2 things that shouldn't be tied together in a motion. I'd like to support a water conservation program. I think this report actually doesn't do enough. I think there's a lot more we can be doing. I'd like to see it come to the water budget and have a real conversation about how much we would set aside for these types of programs instead of voting on that today. So I kind of agree that a deferral is In order, usually, I know certainly Councillor Hollingsworth wouldn't like to defer that today, but the second part I would really like to see a deferral on, if possible.
Worship, I'm prepared to separate that into the two motions, if that will facilitate things. So to read the first motion being council approve universal installation of water meters, water service connections throughout the city of Cornwall, period. One motion, and then somebody, whomever, could make the second half as a second motion, because I think Councillor Bergeron makes a valid point. So to facilitate things, if the seconder is okay with it, I'd be prepared to just make the first part as one motion.
Councillor McDonald.
So a question, if I may, to see if I would accept that as seconder? I'm presuming that's why you're asking me. So are you suggesting we simply get the hardware in this system underground so that someday when we commit ourselves to activating the meters and changing our rate structure that we'll be ready to?
With your indulgence, your worship, not really, I think that water service, conservation and service master plan are not necessarily the same as the water meters. They are kind of two different motions. I mean, I guess the fear is that if you went ahead with if we supported the water meters, but then didn't support the water service conservation plan, you'll have a bunch of meters in the ground with no plan. So I suppose you could make an argument they need to stay together, but I'm prepared to go either way. I guess what I'll do is I'll make it at the period at the end if my seconder supports it, and if she doesn't, I'm still going to support it either way. So
find another seconder, maybe.
Yeah, right.
Sorry.
So just through the chair, please. So if I'm listening to the dialogue, you want to separate this motion into two.
actually, worship, I'll make it simple. Let's keep the motion as it is. I have a seconder, we'll push ahead. And if it gets defeated, then my colleagues can try something else. How's that? Okay, fair
One
enough.
thing we could always do is look at the master plan and amend it at any given time as well, so.
Yes, I question then, since we're keeping this intact, is there a timeline built into this in the plan? I think there is, eh? Like 1925, rather 2025 and then 2030. Obviously, the timeline would be part of us working this out.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, my understanding of Sean Michael's report is essentially that we will, over the next, starting 2023, because we'll need a year of planning, to start installing meters, and the rates will then start at the end of when the meters have been installed. When all the meters installed, that's when we start the new rates. In the meantime, everything is status quo until that period in time. Although there was some suggestion, you know, around council here that, you know, we would start incentive programs immediately, but the new meter rate would not start until 2025.
Right, yeah. I just wanted to be sure that what we're talking about is, once we take the first step, we're committed, basically. There's no wait till the economy turns around before we go to step 2 or something like that.
So, well, I'm going back to Councillor Bergeron because he still has the mic. Excuse me, Madam CAO.
Mr. Mayor, maybe if I could. So what we have in front of council this evening has been the farthest that our administration and council has ever gone to get to the point to have a form of a water conservation plan that includes the installation of a metered system that allows I think the fair billing based on usage of those that are accessing our water. To Councillor Bergeron's comments about water conservation, you think it can go further? I think that I can speak on behalf of our administration. We would probably like to see water conservation go further, but this is a fairly significant step for us at this time. So if council would like to see, as we move forward with part of this plan, if council would like to see more undertakings for water conservation, then I think you're going to find from our administration that we're going to want to work with council to continue to promote that. So it doesn't have to be limited to just what has been identified in the plan tonight. I think we are willing to work with council if there are more initiatives that should be undertaken. We can continue to look at rebates and programs through the budget process. Some of these programs, per Mr. DeWitt's comments, would be implemented immediately to try and, I think, get some of these changes in place. But I just wanted to reinforce water conservation is a fairly big objective for our administration. And if it's council's decision or desire down the road to have more conservation initiatives, then the administration for the city of Cornwall are going to be supportive of that.
Thank you.
Councilor Bergeron.
I still don't know that I support it as the motion stands. I will say, this is a big issue. This is a big item we're voting on here. I kind of agree with Councillor Gardner that this should be deferred. I would actually like to see it even potentially be a ballot question. We're a year out from an election. I think the city of Cornwall, the people, the voters, would love to have their say on this. And I know that is our job here, so I'm prepared to vote tonight. But I won't be supporting water meters. I agree with Councillor McIntosh as well that this report was pretty skewed in one direction, and I tend to not like that either. I felt the same way with the fire hall. I felt like it was telling us, this is what you need to do. And I don't think there's a mandate from the voters here to do this. I don't think I've seen enough justification to push this forward. I'm all for water conservation. I think there's a lot more we can do. I will look for that. I will encourage that to come to budget, to come to the water budget. But as it stands, I won't be voting to support this.
Councilor McIntosh.
Just a point of clarification, who owns the meters when they're installed? Does the homeowner, the homeowner own the meter, or does the city, the corporation own the meter?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the city will own the water meter.
So if any repair work and needs to be replaced, the onus is on the city to replace it?
That is correct.
And no charge to the consumer?
No charge to the owner. Unless the owner mistreats it.
Like, okay, I won't go there.
Never happens. Okay, I haven't voiced my, Councilor Carr, I don't see you in the back rows there.
This is not the closest we've come to water meters. We've talked about water meters every council, I think, for the last 20 years. And one that was very positive and had quite a bit of support was that all new construction of housing and industry had water meters. Okay, they didn't have a choice. If you were building a house, you had to have a water meter. And it sat around for quite a while until finally it just disappeared. Sorry. I'm used to microphones that you have to switch on yourself. What I was saying was, we had a motion by council years ago that any new construction of housing or industry, water meters would be included, and they would pay the price. It wouldn't cost the taxpayer directly any money. So I just wanted to bring that up, and I'll switch this off.
Councilor Towndale.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will be supporting this. Some of the reasons why were raised by Councillor Hollingsworth. There is an inequity where we see the residential sector subsidizing the IC&I sector, which is actually to the detriment of the residential sector. So there is a possibility right now that, we talk about a hypothetical family of 5 and water usage. It's possible they are paying more just based on how much we raise the per fixture cost every year. Then you have, I think there is an inequity in the system that goes beyond that, because you do have residences where you have fewer people living and they're paying more but using less. And then again, you have families that are using more and paying less. So to me, water should be treated like other utilities, like electricity and gas. Yes, there's a standard fee that you pay regardless of how much you use, usually labeled the delivery fee, transmission fee, etc. And then you pay for what you use. But that also gives you control over the cost. I mean, arguably you could say larger families, they're going to use so much regardless. However, there are ways to try to mitigate how much you're using. The way we bill people now, the way we charge, it's okay, you have so many taps, you have so many toilets, this is what you pay. It doesn't matter if you conserve. There's no incentive. I mean, people do it, but there's no incentive right now. This will level the playing field, in my opinion. People will pay for what they use, whether it's more, whether it's less. It'll fix the residential sector subsidizing the commercial and industrial sectors. It'll result in, you know, the example we heard from Mr. DeWitt, where you have some commercial sectors, commercial businesses that are on meters but paying the fixed rate, so they're actually paying a lot less for the water they actually use. That'll be fixed. I understand the concerns raised by Councillor Gardner and Bergeron on timelines, especially now with the pandemic. But in hearing the timeline for installation, we're not even going to start this until 2023, really. Like, ground won't be broken until then. Then it's going to take at least another 2 years to get them in the ground. We're only really going to pull the trigger in 2025. That's 4 years from now. And that's if everything stays on schedule, on time. I don't know if it will, to be honest. You know, there are delays happen in construction all the time. So I think that actually provides a barrier that provides for recovery. And I'm satisfied with that because, you know, if something comes up, we could theoretically revisit this. Whoever's around this table in 2024, 25 could say, hey, we got to stop, delay it for a year, but the infrastructure is getting in the ground in the meantime. We're going to start water conservation measures, providing rebates. I think that's great up front, and that's something easy to do. And this also gives up to 4 years for people to start taking those steps so that when the metered rates come in, they could have highly efficient water fixtures in their homes. And I think that's what we're trying to do as well. So I think all those factors considered. In addition, I didn't mention, there's a cost savings to the city. We're talking about less spent on treatment, chemicals, labor, et cetera, wear and tear. That's something we have to look at in both our water plants because there is wear and tear. And if this helps to detect leaks in our pipes earlier, that's better. Every winter, how many water breaks do we have? It's been trending down because of the repairs that have been undertaken over the last 10, 12 years. But if we can spot leaks in advance and prevent full water main bursts, that's huge. That'll save us money down the road too. So when I look at cost savings to the city, potential cost savings to the consumer, fixing the inequality in the systems, I think this is a green light for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hebert.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I could really sum up my comments by saying ditto to Councillor Hollingsworth. I very much support your take on all of this. I am not pleased with having to add an extra, $17 million to a budget. I'm sure no one is, but as it was mentioned, this has been talked about for decades, and Councillor Hollingsworth, with a yes or no answer back in the 90s when this came up, when you were around the table, was the price tag 17 million? Nope. Definitely not. So if we wait another couple decades, we're going to see this potentially double with what we're seeing, rising cost of everything. And so I think the words "bite the bullet" was mentioned, and I think unfortunately that's what we have to do. And we as council are here to make those unpopular decisions rather than putting it as a ballot question. We were elected to not be liked, but do the decisions and make the decisions that we believe is best for our municipality as a whole and our environment. So thank you for bringing that up, Councillor Hollingsworth. This does seem like a radical step to conserving water and really working towards environmental practices. But it's not radical. We've seen this is happening all over the province. We're very much behind the times here, and we'll keep being behind the times if we defer another year. I know that it's not a great time right now, but will it be in 10 years? Likely not. So it's time to move forward. And the inequities is really what I've been considering these many years we've been talking about this hypothetical family of 5 we talk about could possibly learn some new habits and reduce their water intake. This is what we are asking our residents to do when we put in a bag limit this year. We're asking you to reduce your waste, be more environmentally conscious, so that it's not going to cost you. What's the price tag for a new landfill in 16 years, right? This is very similar to what we're looking at the landfill and the waste reduction. So it's encouraging our residents to bring on new habits, better habits in their lives. And we have a great communications person at the city that can do a lot of that education with our departments. So yeah, it is inequitable the way it is now. I've lived in homes with the same amount of taps as my neighbors, and my neighbor had 5 people living in that home when I was just 2 folks, and so we're paying the same bill and using significantly less water. So I think a lot of families will have to just change their habits and see the reduction in cost. And then, like mentioned, the reduction in costs to the city, the wear and tear, good point, Councillor Towndale, the $300,000 in savings, and like I said, the wear and tear that will need to be replaced eventually, just like the landfill. So it's kind of prevention at the same time. I'm not a fan of an extra $17 million bill, but I'm sure councillors in 15, 20 years won't be fans of, $30,000 bills. So we may be the unpopular ones, but I think it's our decision, and it's a hard one to make, and so I'm ready to vote today to support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Just, I have a couple questions. How long is the installation time period for installing the water meters?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Right now, the time period is slated at 2 years.
2 years. So the cost of the meters, will that be broken up over 2 years?
I'll ask Mr. Bailey to, in terms of the cost or in terms...
Purchase cost.
Through you,
You buy
Mr.
half
Mayor.
1 year, half the next?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's how it is in our financial plan currently. It's over 2 years.
All right. I'm going to support this for a number of reasons. I remember when I was a young lad, we talk about usage of electricity. I used to be reminded steady that turn that light off when you're finished. And so basically the same thing, it comes to usage. And hopefully we will see the cost savings. That's what I'm banking on. And I know it wasn't popular when we built the Benson Center with a lot of people, but sometimes we have to make decisions that aren't totally popular, but I think this is, in the long run, will be popular. And I lived in Rosedale and I was outside the city, and I always thought the city charged us too much for water. But anyway, that's another topic for another day. Anyway, I'll support this, and so we'll call the vote right now.
Recorded vote, please. Recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote.
Read the motion.
The council will approve the universal installation of water meters at all water service connections throughout the city of Cornwall and implement the water conservation program as outlined in the Water Conservation and Servicing Master Plan prepared by Watson and Associates Economist.
Councillors Claude McIntosh?
No.
Dennis Carr?
No.
Sid Gardner?
No.
Dean Hollingsworth?
Yes.
Kelly Nabar?
In favor.
Councillor Elaine McDonald?
Yes.
Justin Towndale?
Yes.
Eric Bergeron?
Opposed?
And Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
5 in favor carries, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Repeat that number, please.
5 in favor,
And, oh, so you don't count the opposed?
4 opposed.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, we have a motion to adjourn, and then we'll be moving into an in-camera session. So, Councillor Gardner, Councillor Bergeron, all in favor? Carried. Thank you.